Hello, I'm Abigail, and welcome to my YouTube channel about everything having to do with books. If you've been around here for a while, you may remember the video that I'm going to do today from one I did last year, which is where I talked about all the books I'd read in school this year. Well, for this video, I'm going to be talking about all the books in school I read this year, which is the 21-22 school year. I read a lot of great books this year, but this video might be a little more interesting than last year's video because last year there was only one book I didn't like, whereas this year there were several books that I didn't like, even though I liked most of them. So, here we go. All the books that I read in the 21-22 school year. The curriculum that I used this year was a British literature curriculum spanning British literature throughout many centuries. So, the first book that I read was one of the oldest pieces of literature in the English language, which is Beowulf, an epic poem by an unknown author. And this book, I feel like I would appreciate more if I had more of a knowledge of like old English language and stuff like that. But for reading it at the point in my life that I am now, it was somewhat hard to understand, and I felt like about twice as long as it needed to be, but it was still interesting, and I'd like to read it again at some point when I have more of an understanding. Next up was Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, which is another epic poem in Middle English history and by another anonymous author. And I liked this one slightly more than Beowulf because, in my opinion, it was easier to understand. And I'm also just really interested in King Arthur and King Arthur's court and all the quests and things like that. So this one was more interesting. But again, like I felt with Beowulf, I feel like I'd understand this one better if I knew more about the age from which it came. But this was interesting to read. And if you like King Arthur legends and stuff as much as I do, you might like to check this one out. Next was the Canterbury Tales, and this is a pretty famous work of literature, so you probably know the premise, but if you don't, here it is. It's that a group of a diverse collection of people is all traveling together, and they agree to each tell a tale to the others, and they'll decide whose tale is the best at the end. And this is funny because I think I liked the premise of it more than I liked the actual stories, because that's such a creative idea. Oh, all these different people from different walks of life telling stories to one another. But I only liked a few of the stories, honestly, and a lot of the humor was not the type of humor that I personally like, but I did like some of them, and I will say overall, I didn't enjoy this book, but I didn't not enjoy it either. It was just kind of, I'm glad to have read it, but I probably won't read it again. We also read The Adventures of Sherlock Holmes, and although you don't see it in the picture, the Memoirs of Sherlock Holmes, and we read select mysteries throughout this, and I'd never read any Sherlock Holmes before, and I really enjoyed it. There were some really fun mysteries that made you think a lot. I think some of my favorite ones were either The Red-Headed League, as a redhead myself, or The Speckled Band, and I would say that those would be the two you should start with if you've never read Sherlock Holmes before, but they're all such fun mysteries, and even though I like some of them better than others, I did enjoy every one of them that I read. And so if you like mysteries and have never checked out Sherlock Holmes, I'd strongly encourage you to. They're all short stories, not very long. Each of them aren't really that long, but they're definitely worth it, and I really enjoyed reading these. Next was Hamlet, which I talked a little bit about in my favorite classics, so you can check that video out, but I really enjoyed reading Hamlet. I personally like Shakespeare, especially the tragedies, which sounds kind of weird, but I like them a lot. And we read the No Fear Shakespeare version, which has both the original text and a modern translation, which made it a lot easier to understand. But even though it was very tragic, it was very interesting. The next book that we read was very, very different from Hamlet. It was The Importance of Being Earnest by Oscar Wilde, which is another play. And this one was just so funny and so enjoyable and a very light read. And you could probably read it in like an afternoon. It wasn't that long at all. And it has a really good movie version as well. So this was just a fun, lighthearted read that I think you'd enjoy if you're looking for one more book to read over the summer. Next was Paradise Lost by John Milton, which is an epic poem about the biblical account of creation in Genesis and the fall of Lucifer. And it was very interesting, but I feel like I would enjoy it a lot more if I actually understood what was happening at any one part. Which, another one, like the books that I talked about at the beginning, perhaps when I'm more educated on like this language and stuff, I would enjoy it more. But I don't really have much to say about it other than the fact that it was very confusing, and I feel like while I was reading it, I could tell this is really good, but I'm not understanding it. So maybe when I have a greater appreciation for this type of writing, I'll go back and read it again. In a very different feel from Paradise Lost, we read Peter Pan next, which I had read before, but I enjoyed reading in class, especially because we just read something so heavy. It was nice to read something a bit lighter. This is just a cute, fun, classic read, and I don't really have too much to say about it other than the fact that it's just, if you've never read it, you should read it. It's super fun and lighthearted, and I enjoyed reading it. Next was The Rime of the Ancient Mariner, which I read in one day because it is a poem rather than a novel, and even though I typically am not a huge fan of poetry, this was interesting. I thought it was a very deep poem that gave you a lot to think about, and I'd like to read it again because even though I understood a lot of it, I know that there was a lot that I didn't understand. So this is a very interesting and deep poem that I feel like everyone should read at one point in their lifetime. We read Frankenstein right around Halloween, which was perfect, and if you've watched my video about my top 10 favorite books that I read in 2021, you will know that I enjoyed this book because it made it onto that list. This is one of the classic horror novels, one of the first ones actually, and it was creepy but not scary in my opinion. So even if you aren't a particular fan of horror like me, you'll probably enjoy this one. It's just a very interesting and fascinating horror novel that doesn't really get you scared but gets you with a lot to think about. Next was the classic story of Gulliver's Travels by Jonathan Swift, and for this one we only read, there were 4 novellas within the whole book about the different travels, and we only read the first 2, and ironically the first 2 were the ones that I liked much more than the other 2. But so it was really interesting and funny and satirical, but I don't think I'd read it again, but I did enjoy it while I did read it. Next was A Modest Proposal, also by Jonathan Swift, which is a very satirical short story. And I'm not going to spoil it for you by telling you what it's about, but it definitely is the definition of satire. And not everybody will probably enjoy it, but I personally enjoyed it, so if you want to read something very satirical, you can check this out. 3 Men in a Boat by Jerome K. Jerome was next. And this book was so funny. It was basically just 3 men who are all pretty much idiots decide to go on a boat trip to escape their daily life. And there were so many funny anecdotes in this. It was just very funny and lighthearted, and you were rolling your eyes about how dumb they were the whole time, but it was still really funny to read. Next was one of my favorite books, which is Emma by Jane Austen, and I'd already read it before we read it in my English class, but we read the annotated version, or at least I read the annotated version, which made it a lot easier to understand some of the cultural meanings behind certain things that happen in the book. It's just such a sweet story, and I just really love it. It's one of my favorite Jane Austen books. Even though I love everything she's written, Emma would be in my top 3. And it's such a sweet novel that I think everyone should read. Another one of my favorite classics is Wuthering Heights, and even though this has a very different feel from Emma, I still enjoyed it. I talked about it a little bit in my favorite classics video, so I won't talk about it too long, but it's just even though it's very dark, it's very interesting, and if you're in the mood for kind of a dark academia, gothic tale about a very dysfunctional family, then you might enjoy this. This next book was the only one that was not written by a British author, but a good portion of the book does take place in England at Oxford, which is why it's included in this curriculum. And this is a book that I liked so much more as it went on than I did at the beginning. It has a very bittersweet ending, I believe, but it was definitely worth it. It was very deep and gave you a lot to think about, and I definitely want to read it at another point in my life, since I don't think I was exactly the target audience, but it was still a very moving and heart-wrenching book to read. Even though I read a lot of really amazing books in English class this year, A Tale of Two Cities easily takes the cake as my favorite book that I read this year, in English class at least. And it might even turn out to be the favorite book that I read in 2022 because it was just so incredible. And I was reading it and I was like, how on earth can someone be this eloquent with language and such an amazing author? And I just feel like everybody should read it. I don't want to say too much about the plot because I don't want to spoil it, but it's about the French Revolution from both Paris and London point of view, and it's just such an amazing book. Switching moods very abruptly, next we read Alice's Adventures in Wonderland and Through the Looking Glass by Lewis Carroll, and I don't know what specifically it was, but I found this book so funny when I read it. I don't really know why, but some of the just like turns of phrase and puns and things like that just struck me really funny. And it was just a very lighthearted read and a classic, and if you know like a young child in your life, this might be a good book to read aloud to them because it's just super funny and super lighthearted, and it was just a super light read, especially after reading Tale of Two Cities. Next was Dubliners by James Joyce, and this was one of the few books we read this year that I didn't really like. It was a collection of short stories about people who lived in Dublin, and there was just an undertone that I didn't really like. Can't really quite describe what it was, but it was just kind of dark and kind of gloomy, and just there wasn't really anything remarkable about it. It's a classic, but I don't really honestly understand why. A British literature curriculum wouldn't really be complete without reading a C.S. Lewis book. We read The Great Divorce next, and this was an amazing allegorical book, much like a lot of C.S. Lewis's other works, and it was just a phenomenal look at death and life that I hadn't really thought of before. And C.S. Lewis is one of my all-time favorite authors, and he just managed to impress me again with this book. Next we read yet another short story, which is The Secret Sharer by Joseph Conrad, and this was a very impressionistic work of literature which I didn't think that I would like, but I ended up really liking, and it was just a fascinating and kind of disturbing but very fascinating read about the idea of a second self or a double, and I just really loved it. I feel like I didn't expect to really like it, but it was a very fascinating short story that I think if you like other short stories similar to this, you should check out. Next was Pygmalion by George Bernard Shaw, and I don't really have too much to say about this, either positive or negative. It was a play, and I like reading plays normally, but this one started out really funny, but then I feel like the author just got bored toward the end, especially in the sequel, which tells what happens to the characters afterwards. That was very unsatisfying. Is that a word? I don't know. But it was just kind of meh. I didn't like it as much as I thought I would like it, but I didn't hate it either. Next was A Passage to India by E.M. Forster, and this was a very interesting read. One of the things that makes it unique is that it's very hard to classify into one specific genre, because it has elements of historical fiction, elements of mystery, but it's just really hard to classify into one genre. And it was a very interesting book to read. I feel like I'd like to read it again at some point in my life, but it was a very deep look into like colonialism in India and how that affected both the British people living there and the Indians themselves living there. And so it was a very interesting read, and I enjoyed it. There are some books that you read where after you finish them, you kind of just have to stare at the wall for a few hours while you think about it. And Lord of the Flies was one of these books for me. It was fascinating and intense and moving, and it was just such an amazing look into like the nature of humanity that some things that I never really thought about before. And it was intense, but not like in a way that made you disqualify the like meaning and depth behind it, if you know what I mean. And so if you're a fan of the Hunger Games, you might like this book because it has some of the similar themes but approached in a very different way. And the last book that we read this year was Right Ho Jeeves by P.G. Wodehouse. And I kid you not when I say that this is one of the funniest books I've ever read in my life. It was a perfect book to close out the year because it's just full of hilarious hijinks and an absolutely stupid narrator, which sometimes is annoying, but in this book was really funny. And I don't want to say too much about it because I don't want to spoil anything, but if you want just like a lighthearted read that you really don't have to think too much about, this would be a good book to check out. Thank you so much for watching this video. I really hope you enjoyed it. Let me know in the comments what some books that you read this school year were and whether you liked them or not. And please remember to like and subscribe if you enjoyed this video, and tell your friend about me if they like books as much as you do. And now we will close this out with a bookish quote. Whenever you read a good book, somewhere in the world a door opens to allow in more light. Vera Nazarian.